Okay, so the very first one, A, is do you guys recognize the muscle tissue it is? So first off, what are the three types of muscle tissues?
Skeletal, smooth, and cardiac.
Okay, so we have skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Okay, so how can we distinguish between skeletal, smooth, and cardiac? So first off, the first one, what do you think this first one? A, very top one. See, somebody says, I can't find my, give me 1 second. Let me find my chat. Here's my chat. There we go. That's right, skeletal. Okay, so what are some unique features about skeletal? And what is its function?
The function of skeletal, they produce heat and protect organs.
So some unique structural features are they're multinucleated. Or multiple nuclei. So that's shown here in these nice little black structures right here on the edges here. Anything else? And you said that they're, say that again, Megan?
They produce heat and protect organs.
Produce heat, protect organs. Okay. So someone said nicely, thermal homeostasis, right? Produce heat and protect organs. Anything else?
So I'm seeing in the book, it says for voluntary movement. What does that exactly mean, voluntary movement? Like it allows something to move?
No, meaning that you kind of control it, right? So like if I decide I want to punch somebody, right? So I decided mentally, I said, I'm going to punch them. I'm using those muscles to punch them, right?
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, so voluntary movement. Okay, and what is one other feature of the tissue itself? So that we can distinguish it between the others.
Like on how it looks? Is that something you want to?
How it looks, yeah.
It's long compared to the other ones, they look shorter.
Okay, so they're long. Multinucleated, long. Let's say long fibers. Anything else? What about these structures here? Those white structures. So they're stratiated. Okay. So those are some ways that we can sit there and remember. Okay. What about the second tissue?
It's a smooth muscle or tissue.
Okay. So this guy, smooth muscle. Okay, so what do we use smooth muscle for?
Involuntary movement.
Involuntary movement. Okay. Anything else?
Um,
What is the word you said earlier? Striations? Is that how you say that?
Yeah, stradiated. So stradiation. Yeah, so
And that's what the white is throughout
Yep.
Each of the tissue?
yep, right here.
Okay, understood.
So in the case of smooth muscle, what are some of the features that we see?
you don't have the stride.
Okay, so we don't, so it's not stradiated.
Straight, not straightated, yeah.
Okay. Or no stradiation. And then is it multinucleated or is it not?
No, it has a
Single.
single nucleus in each
Yeah,
fiber.
so each fiber represents a single nuclei, right? So you see the single box here, that's one cell, that's another cell, here's a cell here, here's a cell here. Okay, and what about cardio muscle, cardiac muscle, which is the last one.
It surrounds the heart. Is it in the heart or it surrounds the heart?
It actually is a little bit of both. It is the heart and surround all of it.
Okay.
So we know that it makes up our heart.
Gotcha.
Okay.
It's
So
also voluntary.
involuntary,
Yeah.
okay. But it's only the heart, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what are some structures? Some of the features about it that will help us recognize it.
It's also short and also a single central nucleus.
So short and one nuclei, one nucleus, one nuclei. Okay,
It's striated.
okay. Okay. Okay, simple.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So, and its function is pumping the heart, right?
Yes.
Or pumping blood, I should say. Okay. Okay, clear. Okay, so this is a neuron. So a neuron is made up of the soma, and the axon, which you guys can see here in the figure. So in the soma, you have your nucleus, you're going to have your mitochondria, And your axon, you're basically going to be using this for signal, right? Or for allowing a potential, your electron potential to travel down it, for signaling to other cells or giving that impulse to other cells. Let's see. So here you're going to have like microfibrils, and then microtubules, and then at the end you're going to like here you have dendrites, which are going to be used for those connective purposes. And at the other side, you're also going to have some dendrites here, but these guys are also going to be used for connecting other cells that are further along. Okay, so it's for sending those nerve impulses through. Okay, and so you guys can kind of take a look at the image here. So you can see how the structure is made up, and it's hard to see the dendrites close up because we don't have a very amplified image. But you can kind of see the axial moving along away from the soma of the neuron. You guys can see that right here. So you have the soma here, and then you have the axial moving out of the screen, in this case, right here. And then your axon, not axial, your axon moving here. So that would be your soma, and then you see your axons moving out that way. So so what is the primary function of the neuron? Anyone? Anyone?
What was the question?
Primary function of the neuron. Anyone? Okay, so the primary function of the neuron, let's see. Oh, sending, okay. So the primary function of the neuron is actually for sending, and also it does some receiving, but primarily it's to send the signals. So you're basically sending electrochemical signals to the body, to the other parts of the body and things like that. So this is going to be making up our nervous tissue. So our nervous tissue is made up of primarily two types of cells. We have neurons and we have neural ganglia. Neural ganglia, there's a couple of cells that falls into the neural ganglia term. So one of those are called astrocytes. Astrocytes are called astrocytes because they look like stars. And so these guys are going to be there's going to be a lot of those guys present in neural tissues, and their goal is basically to receive signals. So these guys are one example of the neural ganglia. So they're going to be receiving those signals. So here, this basically is a neuron, and then this is the axon of the neuron. Now these axons, in the case of the neuron, are coated in the myelin sheath. And so these myelin sheaths are basically they're acting as like insulation. So they're allowing, or they're keeping that electron potential inside the neuron so it can be traveled down the axon. Okay. Without it, you would actually lose some of that signaling along the way, and you didn't want that to happen, right? You want to make sure that the signal is being sent to where it's supposed to. Otherwise, we'd have huge delays in like our responses. Like for instance, if we had our hands on the stove, right? So we're going to have neurons and stuff that are going to be sending that to your brain to say, hey, tell your hand to move, right? And if there's a delay, then you just keep your hand on the stove and you burn the crap out of it. Make sense? Okay, so your myelin sheet, those guys are actually, they're just protein. So a lot of protein that are basically made, and the oligodendrocytes, those guys are responsible for actually making the myelin sheets. So their job is just to make the myelin sheets that are going to insulate the actin. Okay. So these guys make these proteins. Okay. And so, and as a result of it, they also, part of their job is to kind of code. So they use their cell structure to help with that coding part, right? So the delivery and that insulation. Okay. Let's see. We also have the other receiving cells are microglia cells. And so you can kind of see both of the cells that are going to be receiving, they have those dendrites on them as well. So they're like ready to accept the reception. So like, and then they actually interact, and they're kind of interweaving between the neuron cell and the astrocytes, or the microglia cells, right? And so there'll be some type of integration so that they're connecting, they form that connection. And there's multiple forms of connection. So just in case, you know, you get one part that's kind of screwed up, then you still have that interconnecting component. Have you guys seen like plants, where a plant's root grows and it branches out and stuff like that? So that's essentially what's happening in the context of your neurons and your neuroglia, right? So that branching out, it kind of gets interweaving with each other, right? And that's a way of kind of keeping itself rooted, so it's not easily removed, and then also keeping access to, in that case, the soil or the nutrients that are there. But in this case, keeping access to those signals between the two. So, okay. Let's see, try to forget anything. Okay. So any questions on the nervous tissue? Okay, so then let's talk about Jesse. It's so funny. The second lecture always goes so much more smoother than the first lecture. I don't know why.
Confidence, because you've already said it before.
Oh, that it's my end. Okay, that's good. Confidence. Okay, so, but I think it's also because I think everybody's coffee is kicked in at this point, you know, since it's right after lunch.
Yep.
You know, and in the morning it's kind of like, and me included, I'm like, okay, yeah, yeah, So, anyway, so the next part that I want to talk about, and this is a part that we want to kind of pay a little bit closer attention to, and that's basically tissue healing. So we've talked about the tissues and everything like that. We kind of talked about every one of them. So during basically when you have a cut or like a burn or something like that, it requires our skin to basically heal, right? And so like I have a huge scar on my leg from when I was a young kid, I should say young kid. And when I was in high school, I did some stupid stuff, you know. And so I actually have a lot of scars from doing a lot of stupid stuff. Some of them when I was young and some of them when I was older, but you know, that one is the one that's the biggest stupid thing that I've done. But one day I'll tell you the story. So, okay, so what happens in this case, right? The very first thing that typically happens when you get your wound and everything, you have clotting occurs, right? We want to clot that area so you don't bleed out, particularly if it's a deep cut. Okay, so then as you start clotting, you're going to get clotting proteins that are there, right? And so there are going to be certain factors, K, H, all of those proteins are involved in that clotting event, right? Without it, it takes a while for you to clot. And then if it takes a while for you to clot, it also takes you a while for you to heal, right? So you'll have clotting proteins, you'll have plasma proteins, all of that is going to be responsible. So these proteins are going to be responsible for forming what our scab, right? So our blood is going to kind of dry up there. So those plasma proteins, those clotting proteins are also going to go there, and then things like that. So also you're going to get, your nerve cells are basically going to be sending out some inflammation signals and stuff. So in addition to sending impulse saying, "Do you're bleeding," right? Your nerve and your artery are going to essentially say, "Hey, let's inflame that area," because inflammation kind of lets us know that we need to bring other stuff there. So we'll need to bring some of our defense cells. So we're going to bring our macrophages and some of our white blood cells that are going to act as defense to sit there and protect us from any outside sources. Okay, so those signals are going to be sitting there released, and it's going to become inflamed. So then in that case, in that cut, it's going to get very, very, very tender around it, partially to try to help you from allowing, invaders in. So it's like bacteria, parasites, foreign cells, pollen, other things from outside, trying to protect you from that. Your scab is going to be doing that. In addition to that, the cells are going to also be there to do that. And so it's going to be tender, right? So after you get cut, red, tender, right? And so that's just your immune system taking its place, doing its job, right? So that means that we need access, and some of your cells are going to be woven in there already, and they're just going to become active. They're going to start functioning. So then you're going to have fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are going to start generating the granulation tissue for restoration. You're going to start restoring that area, right? And so you're going to be putting cells in there. So more and more cells are going to start coming there, forming a little tissue, right? And so these cells, their job is to basically get there, kind of clot that up, and then allow mending to start occurring, right? So then you're able to get there and have mending. And then as a result of that, you're going to have internal scar tissue, right? Because what happens to this tissue here, well, a lot of it is programmed cell death. You're going to have tissue that is just sitting there that is going to be dead, right? So it's going to be dead tissue, it's going to be scar tissue, and that's going to be underneath the skin, right? So of course you're going to have that happening. You're going to have this part is going to be your epithelial area is going to be restored, and so and then often we'll have a little indent or a scar as a result of it, right? If you have scar tissue that remains, so you can have scar tissue from that internal part all the way up to that surface can occur if you're not careful. But ideally over time, what happens is that it's just the epithelial tissue is matured and restored, and then it continues to look somewhat normal. But if you're not careful, you get scarring, and certain people are more apt to scarring, certain pigments, skin tones, and stuff like that than others. And that's because the keratin production that would happen in there. So you'll have certain skin tones that produces high levels of keratin that results in that discoloration and that scarring tissue, okay? So this guy, you're gonna have like collagen fibers that are gonna be in there along with everything. And so that's that collagen and that the fibroblasts and stuff like that are all going to be in that area is going to result in that internal scarring, right? And so how many of you guys have had a scarring and you've had the doctor that says, well, you need to massage it daily to kind of break up that scar tissue? Because otherwise, if you leave that scar tissue in there, it could also cause problems, right? Have you heard of that? Like if you had, any of you guys had knee surgery or? No. So Alejandro, so you're like, so you hate needles and you hate going to the doctors? Okay, so, well, if you ever go to the doctor and you get that scar and you have to get stitches and everything. So they'll tell you, like after you've healed, they want you to sit there and massage that area. Partially the massage that area is to kind of break up that scar tissue, because that scar tissue, again, is going to be a combination of dead cells, those fibers and stuff that are there. You want to kind of break it up so that it gets kind of reabsorbed by the body, and also so that you get, in a sense, complete healing without the scar tissue, because the scar tissue could actually start, it could cause your joints to kind of lock up. It could cause functions not to behave. It could dampen some of your impulses from the electrical impulses from the nerves. And so you want to sit there and make sure that that scar tissue is gone, right? And so they'll say, okay, massage that area and things like that. You sit there and try to break up the scar tissue that's formed there. Okay, and that's something that's kind of developed over years, because at first they just stitch you up and say, okay, you're good to go, bye, you know, and that's it. Now they're starting to recognize that that scar tissue is kind of damaging. You want to try to get it removed. Sometimes what they'll have to do is actually go in another time and remove the scar tissue, because it alone, the scar tissue alone, can cause the inflammation, right? So that can cause all of those signals to come out, and inflammation can cause necrosis, right? You guys have heard of necrosis? Let's see. Anyone? Necrosis. Dying cells. Yes. Okay. So necrosis is basically, it's cells that are gonna die. So cells that are dying. Okay. So necrosis is when you have accidental cell death, right? And accidental cell death basically can cause that inflammation. It causes things like that. But inflammation can also cause other cells to die, because you're trying to get those cells around them to kind of kill over, right? So this is accidental. And we have what we call apoptosis. So apoptosis is programmed cell death. Okay, so necrosis is necessary and apoptosis is necessary. Necrosis is kind of like that fast response, because, you know, those cells are going to die anyway, or they're dead. Okay. And then apoptosis is when you're planning cells to die, right? So for instance, in wound repair, these cells are planned to die, right? Because that's going to cause your scarring, right? And it's also going to allow things to kind of mend and get fixed, because those cells are there to do their certain job, and then they need to die at a certain point, because we don't want those cells to stay there and remain there, because that area isn't supposed to have high levels of fibroblasts. It's not supposed to have high levels of macrophages and stuff. They're supposed to do a certain job, get there, clean up. Well, they're not going to move, but they're going to basically scar there to allow things to mend even better. And then over time, hopefully they get removed by being absorbed. Okay. So we need that programmed cell death, right? We want cells to die at a certain point. We don't want them to keep growing forever and ever and ever, because we know that that causes issue, right? Because that's kind of like the cancer, right? And we want cells to stay around for a certain while, because we also know that cells kind of get old, and as cells get older, then they start kind of losing control, and that kind of leads them to become cancer. They start losing control. So we want to set up a point where they're going to actually just have, you know, a couple of life cycles and stuff like that, and then they die out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we want that programmed cell death, and we want that necrosis, but we don't want that necrosis to occur randomly, right? Or just, you know, have you heard of, like, okay, so you have necrotic tissue. Anybody been bit by like a spider or anything like that? No one? Okay. So my dad got, this was about 7 to 10 years ago, my dad got bit by a brown recluse spider, and the area kind of, it was infected. He got stripped in that area, So there's two things that happen because of the venom in there. Venom sends these signals that causes your cells to go through necrosis. It starts killing those cells around it, but it also starts sending these other signals that they need to die as well too, right? So you're getting almost like immediate cell death as a result of it. And so that tissue around it, and it's partially because the spider uses it to kind of soften that area, make it a little, so it's not, there's nothing there to really put up a fight. So it can get in there and just get what it wants, get going, right? And so the spider does for two reasons. So it uses the bacteria that the spider has in its fangs to sit there and help work that tissue to make it a little bit weaker. And then it also uses some of the proteins in the venom itself to do exactly the same thing. So then it causes those cells to start to die. And as those cells die, they weaken, they're easier target. So it's trying to get into that lower layer where it can get the blood or you know, the meal, the real meal, right? And so in that context, that tissue will send signals to the tissue around it. And then those signals will send more signals around it. So the area around a certain area in my dad's, I guess it was in his arm or leg, I can't remember exactly, where they actually had to go in and remove large portions of tissues because that tissue became necrotic. It was dying, it was dead as a result of the proteins in the venom, and then also a result of the bacteria in the strep. That was part of the flora of the spider. And so they had to go in and cut around it to some of the live tissue because that tissue became necrotic. Okay, so you kind of see how necrosis plays its part as well as apoptosis. Okay, where apoptosis is saying, okay, you have a certain lifespan, you're supposed to die. That's it, you're dead. Okay. Are you guys with me?
Yeah.
Okay. It sounds weird, but you know, that's it. Okay. Okay. So again, if we think about it, we have to have that clotting event. So that clotting is a form of control. So we need to pay attention to that. So we want to be aware of that clotting must occur first. We also have the event where we have inflammation, and inflammation plays this part. We have necrosis, and we have apoptosis. So make sure you guys understand the difference between them and how, not necessarily how they're regulated, because we know that the proteins are involved in that regulation, and we can go into that. I mean, there are a lot of proteins that are involved in the apoptotic pathway. Some of them are endocytic components, and some of them are proteins, surface proteins, receptors, and stuff. So those, but the concept of those guys have to be controlled. If they're not controlled, then you don't get appropriate scarring, you don't get clotting, you don't get things like that. And so there are a lot of diseases and drug use that can affect these processes, right? So, for instance, alcohol. How many of you guys drink wine? Anybody drink red wine? Nobody? Oh, how many of you guys are old enough to drink? We'll start with that. Yeah, last Saturday. Okay, so those who are old enough to drink, right? So if you guys are drinking alcohol, alcohol is also used as a blood thinner. But primarily red wine is known to thin your blood a little bit, right? So if your blood is being thinned, that's going to affect your clotting time, right? So it's going to take you a lot longer to clot. So alcoholics are known to sit there, be big bleeders, because as a result of it, they drink consistently, they have alcohol in their blood system consistently. So as a result of it, the clotting factors are not behaving the way they should. Okay. How many of you guys smoke? No smokers? That's good, huh? Okay, good. Okay, so smoking is also known to sit there and affect your clotting, and actually it also affects scarring. So you don't scar quite right, so you don't maintain good scars, and so you end up having to reclot and go through that process. So it takes them a lot longer to heal. Okay, and then as a result, that is a result of some of the factors that you find in cigarettes. So those starts to affect, you know, the secretion of some of the chemicals that are involved in that inflammation response, also involved in the clotting, right? So things, environmental factors or things that we do can also affect the aspect of that. Somebody earlier today had mentioned diabetes, right? So diabetics are also known to sit there and have issues with clotting, right? And so they're big bleeders as well, right? So because of their blood sugar, and that has to do with the fact that you're not having enough energy to sit there and do the job and do it well. So, okay. So you can kind of see how one aspect, let's say control of your metabolism, because sugar, right? That's metabolism. We think about it as food and stuff like that. But if that's not being controlled, that can affect normal function in your body as well too. So if you're starving yourself, chances are you're going to bleed a lot faster, right? Than if you're not. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about aging. How many of you guys are going to stay young forever? All right. All of them. You're going to stay young forever?
I wish.
Mm. Yeah. Don't we all, right? You know, we all wish that we could still be 21 like me, right? So, okay. So we age, right? Our body ages. Okay. So there are a couple of things that happen as we age. Our hair starts to thin, our tissue starts to dry, it's thinner, you know, bones become a little more brittle. So there are a lot of things that are happening in that context. If we start looking at them in terms of a genetic level, in terms of aging, our chromosomes are getting shorter, right? And that also is thought to have an aspect in aging. Our water content, our desire, first off, our desire for water also changes. As we get older, we're often have to telling ourselves, okay, you got to drink more water. Part of it is because we have a lot more choices as an adult. We stubborn. I have to have my coffee, right? I can't live without my coffee, right? So I'm not drinking as much water as I should, or I gotta need that Coke. You know, midday I gotta have my daily Coke, or or at night after I'm grading an exam, I have to have 4 glasses of wine to sit there and get me through these classes, right? So those things play a part of it, as well as our signals in our bodies that start to get kind of warped, right? And so things that are natural cravings. So I need to rehydrate. You guys have points where you feel real thirsty,
Yeah.
right? So, but as you get older, some of those desires, some of those points where you're starting to feel thirsty, all of that are parts of signal. Well, they get warped as well, right? And some of it, again, is environmental factors. But some of it is the fact that our body is not functioning as effectively as they did when we were in our 20s, teens, or things like that. Although our teens are kind of funky because we're still trying to figure things out, right? So, at least the body's still trying to figure it out. We may have to start using glasses or things like that. Our hair turns gray, because melanin isn't producing the way it was supposed to. And so all of these things start to happen over time, okay? And it's a natural occurrence. It's part of who we are and what we do. Because of that, right, as I said, a lot of it has to do with at the genetic level. We're starting to lose some of those genes that kind of control that process, or those genes are not controlled as effectively as they were because our chromosomes are shortening. So there's a protein called telomerase. Its job is to make sure that our chromosomes stay lengthened long enough. And if our chromosomes doesn't keep a certain length, what is called the telomeres. So it's just extra sequence added at the end of the chromosomes to kind of keep them from shrinking, right? Over time, that telomerase doesn't work as effectively. And you start to get shrinking and you start losing some of that genetic information. You start getting mutations occurring. You get things that control the cell cycle. And so you start getting more cells that are growing more than what they should, and the ones that should be growing are not growing, things like that. A lot of cell death that is not supposed to happen. And as a result of that, it starts to affect the body, right? And so then that affects aspects of our tissue, that affects aspects of our organs. And so it is kind of just amplified, okay? Have you guys heard of atrophy?
Yes.
What is atrophy?
It's kind of like where your muscles break down and they're not, I don't know, to my understanding, as dense as they used to be.
That's right. So you start to lose some of that mass that's associated with your muscles, right? So your muscle fibers are starting to break down. So for instance, if you go in a coma, you go through atrophy. How many guys have broken a bone?
I
Nobody
have
broken?
actually, yeah.
Yeah. So were you in a cast?
Well, I fractured my clavicle, so that my arm was immobilized for
Okay.
a couple
So
months.
during that time of immobilization, like you had a certain mass that was associated with it, but afterwards, after you healed and everything, didn't you have to go through physical therapy? And they said, oh yeah, your arm and shoulder and stuff is atrophied, right?
Yeah.
So basically, the muscles have basically been broken down because they're not being used, they're not storing that glycogen, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And as a result of it, you go through that process. Like during COVID, my legs have atrophied some. Well, but my butt has made up for it because it got bigger, you know. So because I'm sitting at the desk consistently, 24/7, so I'm not as active as I am. So I go through some form of atrophy, right? So, so all of that is unfortunately, is part of that aging. If we have an active lifestyle when we're younger, but as we get older, become more responsible and all that good stuff, we sit in an office and sit on our butts more frequently, right? And so those things are things that deal with that physiological changes that are associated with aging. Okay, and it affects the tissue level. Well, it actually affects, those earlier levels. So we go at the chromosomal level and then just amplify it all the way up. Okay. Okay, so one last thing. Come on. Maybe. If my slide moves for me. Okay, it's cancer. Okay, so we've talked about cancer before. So what happens in the case of cancerous cells? And then we'll talk about how that affects tissue and stuff.
The cells aren't regulated, out of control.
So the cells are growing out of control, right? So in other words, they're in that cell cycle, but they're not doing the things that they're supposed to do in that cell cycle. Those checkpoints have gotten all screwed up. So they're growing a lot faster than what they're supposed to. So if you guys remember, during that cell cycle, the cell, it gets to a certain size and it's okay, now it's time to divide. Well, you've kind of screwed that up. So the cells are going to be smaller, right? Because they're going to be growing faster than what they're supposed to, right? They're not going to have as much content. So the nucleus is going to be smaller, right? So all of this is happening and these cells are just, they're going, and they're going, and they're going, and they're going, right? So then that's going to affect that tissue organization, right? Because that cell size is going to play a part in how that tissue behaves. Not only that, if things are missing, if you're not making all the stuff that you're supposed to make before you start dividing, right? Then how are you going to adhere if you're not making enough adherence? How are you going to, and then how are you going to get polarity in terms of, let's say, basal and lateral, right? So how are you going to get orientation to which way you're supposed to grow? All of that stuff gets distorted in this context of cancer, okay? Now, if those things are getting distorted in cancer and you're not adhering, if you're not sticking the way you're supposed to, right, to the other tissues or to the other cells in the tissue, then what's going to happen over time? Well, let me give you a little hint, right? So in this case, we have this cancer cells. These cells start dividing like crazy. Can you guys see my spotlight here? These cells here, they start dividing like crazy. Can you guys see my spotlight? Well, okay. So they start dividing like crazy, right? So they're getting tons and tons of acceleration. Okay, so that part, those cells there that are dividing like crazy, they're not adhering the way they're supposed to. They're actually getting a little bit smaller than what they normally are. So So you're getting more and more cells that are packing in there. So the no cells, they divide some more and then they get even more, right? So this here represents carcinoma, right? And as a result of this, these cells representing carcinoma, they're going to affect the cells around them, right? So these guys are going out of control. They're not regulated. They're sending signals that they're not supposed to send. So these cells are next to them are going to be like, hey, what in the hell are you, right? You're not supposed to be doing that, right? So these guys are sending these guys signals, but the guys inside are ignoring their signals, and they're just sending out their own random things. So these guys start to get confused over time. They're like, hey, I don't know who I am, right? Okay, so in addition to that, these cells over time, because they're going to lose those adhering factors that are supposed to be generated at a certain level to keep it sticking to the tissue, it's no longer sticking to the tissue. So then that tissue, this whole clump of cells could actually start breaking off. So what happens if those cells break off or that tissue breaks off? Have you guys heard of metastasis? You've not heard of metastasis? So one of the biggest things that why cancer continues, right, is because the adhesion molecules, those factors, those adhesion factors that kind of causes cells to stick together to form those tissues, right? They're not being generated the way they're supposed to. They're not being secreted the way they're supposed to, right? And so that tissue becomes a large mass that's kind of hard and everything like that, partially because you have a lot of cells that are growing in it. And then the other thing is that you start getting breakage, right? Breakage of clumps of cells because it's not sticking the way it's supposed to. It's not connecting the way it's supposed to. So if something is loosely connected, if you don't have a lot of glue on it, then those cells are able to go. They're able to break off. Now, if they're able to break off, and then they get into the bloodstream or they get into the lymph node system, then they'll start going to, let's say, the lymph nodes or going to other areas, the lungs, right? So for instance, my mom had breast cancer, right? So her lump had gotten so big that those adhesion factors weren't really connecting. So when they finally recognized that she had breast cancer, it already started metastasizing, right? They found them in her lymph nodes and they found them in her lungs. So it's tissues that were initially found up in her breast that moved from her breast to the lymph nodes and then also to the lungs. So then it goes there, it sticks loosely to that tissue and then it starts growing. Now, if you have breast tissue compared to lung tissue, they have two different jobs, right? Because breast tissue is supposed to be there to make milk and stuff like that, right? And lung tissue is supposed to be there to sit there and help your lungs function. So they're sending different signals to each other, right? So then that lung tissue is sending signals to the breast tissue, say, hey, dude, you're supposed to be lungs. You're not supposed to be here, right? So it's sending signals, but that cell is not responding the way it's supposed to because it's going out of control. It's not taking in the signals around it. And so the lung is saying, hey, dude, you really need to die, and sending signals, hey, you really need to die. You don't belong here. This cell is saying, ignores all of them because it doesn't have those receptors anymore. It doesn't have any of those things that says, okay, yeah, I need to control myself. It's all out of control. And it's just sending out signals. Over time, those signals that it sends out starts affecting the environment. It sends out more signals than the cells that are originally supposed to be there. And it starts telling those cells, you're not who you're supposed to be, right? And so it starts affecting that environment. So those are called microenvironments. So, and tumor cells are notorious for when they get from one cell type or one tissue type in that area, and those cells start telling those other cells, hey, you're not who you're supposed to be because it's sending out all of these crazy signals, right? And so it starts affecting those cells. And then that environment gets more and more apt for that tumor, and it causes more and more damage, okay? So somebody compared it to a toxic relationship, right? Where you get like a boyfriend or a girlfriend that says, you ain't gonna be crap, you're never gonna be crap. And they tell you that all the time, right? Like you're dumb or, something like that. And they're constantly telling you that. Like if you get enough people telling you that, what happens?
You're gonna believe it.
You're gonna start believing it, right? So that's essentially what's happening to those cells. They're like, oh, wait a minute, hold on. I'm not a lung cell? No, who am I then? You know, and it gets confused and its environment starts changing. Okay, and so that's one of the things that we've kind of learned about how cancer works. So during metastasis, that's huge, huge, you know, that's a bad part. We want to try to get that tumor out before it metastasizes, before it moves to another tissue, because then it starts causing those issues. Okay. So, are you guys with me? You understand?
Yeah, I understand.
Okay. So, okay, so let me see. We are actually going to stop here. Our next topic is going to be chapter 5. We're going to be talking about the integrin system. Chapter 5, integumentary system. Okay. When we talk about this, right? So let's kind of think about it, because we have talked about some of the tissue that's involved. Now we're going to talk about the entire system, right? So thinking about some of the tissue that's involved and everything like that, what is the function of the tissue? Because that's the integumentary system, just the skin, right? The skin, right? So in this context, what is its job? What is it there for?
To protect everything inside from the outside.
Okay.
Kind of, I don't know the word that I'm looking for right now, but
So for protection, let me see. Stop sharing. So protect our internal organs and also protect, like you said, the internal and the external. Okay, sounds good. Anything else?
is skin used for heat regulation too?
It is used for heat regulation, right?
All
Thermal
right.
regulation. That's right. Okay. Anything else? Do me a favor. Put your hand on a hot iron.
Oh,
gonna
sensory,
happen?
sensory functions.
That's right. And sensory functions. All right. Another one. Excretion of waste products. Yep. So we get rid of some of our waste products. And then also, well, just as you said, temperature regulation. Also, we also secrete or excrete certain things, some of the oils and stuff like that, not only for waste, but also in terms of protection, right? Because we kind of use that oil to sit there and keep things from living on our surfaces. And, you know, you put a little oil on your skin gets a little oily, does it not?
It
serves
does.
two purposes. It's to get rid of some of the excess that we have, but also, you know, you're supposed to be getting enough as a lubricant to help kind of flush some of those things that would be there to some of the bacteria. But as we go through puberty and stuff like that, our pores kind of get clogged, and, you know, because you're producing a little bit too much, your body's trying to figure out how much should I be producing, and it gets out of hand. It tries to figure those things out. And some of us went through that. If I remember right, Alejandro, right? Okay. So that's pretty much it that I have for today. We'll pick this up on Wednesday, so we'll probably be going over, I'm gonna try to get 2 chapters in. So because this, the next chapter is pretty small, pretty short in terms of the physiology component. And then, so then the next one after that is chapter 6, which is, I believe, bones, bone tissue, so the skeletal system. So we'll talk a little bit about the function and the physiology of that. So. Okay. We'll at least start it, and then we'll finish it up when you guys get back. Okay. So I have nothing else for you today. You kind of get a relaxed day, start prepping for the test. That's all I got for you today. Any questions?
Nope.
Yeah. I'll see you guys on Wednesday then.